right. Thank you. I'm curious to know, we'll start off with a question. How many of you all have ever bought a pair of shoes online? Really? How many guys have ever bought a pair of shoes online? Okay, there are some. You all are people of great faith. Now, maybe your shoes, you have nice shoes and you know exactly if they're already going to fit. Maybe you have a pair just like it and you know what you're getting. But I would never buy a pair of shoes online. I've got to try my shoes on, right? My whole life, I've never bought a pair of shoes without trying them on because they might look okay on the outside, but once you get in them, it might be a different story. And so as a boy, it's time for school to start, and I have to go to the department store. We lived way out in the country. And so to go to where we could actually buy shoes was a 45-minute drive. And I had to make that in with my parents, go to the department store, never did care much for it, had to buy shoes. And Dad says, try these on. And so I walk around. How'd that feel? Well, you ever done that? And it feels odd because that other shoe is connected by a rubber band, and so it hits you in the back every time you step. And so it never feels right. So then you've got to put both of them on, and then you can only walk like this because you break that band, you have to buy them, and you don't know if they fit yet. So I'd never buy a pair of shoes online. I'd never buy a car without test driving it either. Have to have some experience with it. And so some of you your level of faith exceeds mine tremendously. There are two types of questions that we ask, and we, I mean by believers. There's two types of questions, and they need to come in a particular order. The first one is this the right thing to do? The normative question, the ethical question, is this the right thing to do? Our belief, our faith is not just a faith of feelings, not just of information, not just of activity, but also oughtness. What ought you to do? What ought you not to do? And that's a major portion of our faith. We can't say it's just morality, but there's a big portion of it. And then we ask that second question, does it work? How do we make what we know we ought to do, how do we make that work out in life? How do we manage it once we know the right thing to do? That right thing that's been revealed to us by a higher source. That's why we're called followers. We follow someone else. We follow the Lord. And so this is our order. It's dangerous to get these reversed and to ask questions perhaps like the world would typically ask. They only have one question, not two, and that is, what works for me right now? That's typically the worldly approach. And you have been in a situation, you've been in trouble again, you can't believe you did this again. You're in a spot that's not happy for you right now, and you might think back and trace your thinking and realize, oh, I was living out of this mindset. I was doing whatever felt good in the moment, and I forgot to ask or forgot to care what I ought to do. And a lot of times we'll find ourselves in difficult circumstances in a world of hurt because we've asked a worldly question. We have forgotten what to ask. Now, the topic we'll hit today on relationships, before I tell you what it is, you might have various different beliefs in this area. Maybe you've never really thought much about it. It's never come across your path, even though that's unlikely. And if that's your current state of mind, I'm thankful that you're here. I'm glad that you're here. I'm thankful for you, and I pray that something we do this morning will help you to think through something and make wise decisions in the future. Some of you, as soon as I say it, you're going, why are we talking about this? There's a lot of things in the student handbook that keep us from getting to this here, and so why would we even be dealing with this? Well, this is an issue that is in the world and sometimes in the church, and so if you're thinking that, I'm glad you're here, and I hope that what we do this morning will confirm something that you perhaps already believe. Others of you may have been brought up where this is common. You might be a product of this type of relationship, and it seems to be working in some ways around you. And it may be even something that you might entertain in the future. If that's the case, I'm thankful for you. I'm glad that you're here, and I pray that something that we do this morning will be edifying as we see the big picture of this issue. And this issue is, what happens or why do people live together before they get married? What does that look like? How does that play out for most people? And where did it all start? How did we get to the point to where this is now a normal part of transition for people in your generation and people even in my generation, the older people? And even the real old people, there's not very many. There's a few back here that are older, who are in the baby boomer generation perhaps. But where did this start? Probably in your grandparents' generation. If your grandparents were born in the late 40s, early 50s, they were part of that 60s generation that came up and did everything a little different, right? And so you may know, maybe your grandmother was a hippie and you don't know that. Maybe she wasn't, but she was probably in that generation of people that started to experiment for the first time. And they experimented because institutions were evil. After the Second World War, in which the entire globe was in conflict, after that, after we saw the institution of governments, military, economics, schools, and even churches fail, people said we will no longer trust institutions. And marriage was an institution. And so the first people who lived together were those who said, we do not believe in the institution of marriage. We have a very low view of it, and I don't need a piece of paper. And these people rebelled against marriage as an institution. They have a very negative view of it. Love will keep us together. I don't need a contract to do that for me. And the people that did this, they typically came from intact homes. They were rebelling against everything they'd known. I assumed, before I started researching this a couple years ago, that people that do this today, people in my generation and your generation, also do this for the same reason. And I was shocked to find that particularly in your generation, it's nothing, there's not even a close reason like this in terms of why people today live together before they get married. I'd like you to we'll take about 30 seconds. I'd like you to talk among yourselves and say, why do you think people typically will live together today in your generation, a little bit older, instead of or before getting married? Take 30 seconds. Let's get a few good reasons. All right. Hopefully you've got a few that you've come up with. Someone shout one out. I'll call you out here. Finances? Convenience? Trying it out. Same reason I try on my shoes, right? Someone back there? Right? Sex? Okay, yeah. They're asking that question. They don't see anything wrong with it because they're only asking that one question of what works for me right now. Anyone else that we didn't list? No accountability? Oh, to see if you're compatible. Right. Okay. The feminists were the ones in the 60s that pushed the agenda that said marriage is bad for women. They shouldn't do it. And we'll see if that's true. They shouldn't do it. And the idea was that they'll come to a relationship without getting married. They'll be an equal partner. And the man will be much more likely to be more kind and more contributing to the relationship because there's no strings tying her to it, and she'll leave. That was the original feminist argument. And so we'll see how that plays out here. Everything you mentioned is par for the course. That makes perfect sense. There's one overwhelming reason that I didn't hear as to why most young people will say that they're different, how your generation is different. And that is, unlike the first people who tried living together first, currently people who live together before getting married, because they do so because they believe, 62% among your generation, that it will greatly decrease the chance of a future divorce. I'm saving myself from a divorce. Now, all those things you said, compatibility, you might say convenience, those all maybe fit into the nature of the relationship, but what we're really worried about is we're trying to save ourselves from this. Because you see the problem of divorce. The people who first came up with this idea, they didn't. But you all know it. If I were to pass around a microphone and we all had as much time as we wanted to talk about what is the negative impact in your life of divorce, we would be here for days. Maybe you haven't experienced it personally, but maybe you've worked with or tried to minister to someone, a friend of yours, their parents went through divorce, and it's rampant, and it's a road of carnage that it leaves behind. And we all know that. We don't have to spend time in chapel talking about the ill effects of divorce. We know that we want to avoid that at all costs. We've seen what it does to people, generationally, spiritually, emotionally, financially. We've seen what it does. And so the question is this: how do we avoid divorce at all costs, which is a wise move, but how do we still deal with this universal longing to not be alone? Genesis 1, God creates. And what does God say after he gets done creating each day? It is good, right? Only God can say that and not brag. It's good. Day 2, it's good. Day 3, it's good. There's only one thing that isn't good in creation before sin. What is it? It is not good for man to be alone. God said that before sin enters the world. It's a universal human longing, regardless of whether you believe in anything in the Bible or not. You talk to people about what's a universal human longing. It's to avoid isolation, to avoid loneliness. So we can't escape that longing, but we must escape the chance of having a divorce. So there's this middle ground, something that seems like will work out. We'll live together. That way we can have the advantages of the marriage relationship without having to have the carnage of divorce. Makes sense. And many of the things you all mentioned were some of those advantages of marriage. See if it works. Does it work? That's the big question. I'm thankful that you are young people in the year 2016, because now we can tell with a significant amount of certainty of at least how this works. And I know some of you are thinking, wait a second, there's that ethical question first. Yeah, we've had plenty of chapels on the ethical question. I also want to expand on, well, does it work? This great experiment, how is it going for people? What does it look like? Because 62% of young people say, this is how you avoid divorce. You should live together first. It only makes sense. You got to try it before you buy it, right? That's the way you should do it. And so at this point, the reason it's fortunate for you to be where you're at, in one way it's fortunate in that there have been thousands of studies since the 60s, tens of thousands of couples, hundreds of researchers and research institutions in several countries who have studied this over several decades. Very sophisticated statistical analysis by top researchers who have been isolating, all things being equal, like finances and urban or rural and how old they are, all other things being equal, how does the cohabitating couple end up, and how does the married couple end up? What do they report? Now, these are secular research institutions. Penn State, UCLA, Rutgers, St. Louis University, San Francisco University. There's about 15 major research state universities who have departments and sociology departments and family research departments who spend millions of dollars researching this. They have no biblical agenda to push. They're not trying to offend morality. They're just saying this is what the numbers show. And after thousands and thousands of research studies, they have started to now put all these together to where we can have some pretty good statistical measures to see how this works out. And of those things that I have been researching in the last few years, I've just picked out 4 or 5 to look at. Someone said finances. We're going to do this, or faithfulness. We're going to do this to see about faithfulness. And here's some of the stats we'll just go over quickly. A live-in boyfriend is 4 times more likely than a husband to cheat on his live-in girlfriend. So in trying it out for marriage, it doesn't seem to work unless you want that kind of marriage. And they even isolated sexual permissive attitudes among married couples and live-in couples. And even with those things being equal, this is still what we find. The live-in girlfriend, 8 times more likely to cheat. Now, this doesn't mean that women are twice as likely to cheat than guys. That's not what that means. We're comparing the live-in girlfriend with the wife. The key is that when the lady gets the ring on her finger, she's much more likely to be faithful than the guy is, even when he gets the ring on his finger. Now, why is this? Well, there's no vows. I mean, isn't living together partially about keeping your options open? Isn't that kind of the reason that we're going to do this? Many couples, they don't say this to their live-in partner, but when they're alone with the researcher or filling out the surveys, they will typically report that, I'm keeping my options open. I want the benefits of marriage. I'm practicing marriage, but not necessarily practicing it with this to be married to this person. What if something better comes along? And how do I know if something better comes along unless I'm still out playing the field? Okay? It makes sense. In that sort of logic, it does make sense. How do I know if something might come along better? And so they speak of their live-in partner as a placeholder. They're a placeholder for now, for the time being, till something better comes along. Isn't that romantic? You've longed to be someone's placeholder in life? Finances, that's a big one, often cited for people. We do this for the pragmatic reason of saving money. However, in study after study, they have found that the cost savings, quote, of living together has been shown to be an economic myth for several reasons. And that is, first off, that since the person is still technically single, they are still spending like a single person. There's a radical difference. Who's married in here? Raise your hand if you're married. Okay, we could talk to each of these people and say, what happened to you financially when you got married? There was something that clicked. Something just clicked. I know most college students don't have a lot of money. You single or married, you don't have much money. And I'm amazed still at the discussions of what you spend your money on. Hey, did you get the latest DVD series of, what are you doing buying DVD series? What are you talking about? Did you the $6 cup of coffee? You don't do that as much after you're married. There's something that just clicks. You just think about it differently. Because the live-in couple since it's not established, they don't think about building wealth together as a team. They never think about saving together for the future. It just doesn't click. Even the young person who is a saver, who moves in and they're the type of person who saves, they're still only saving for themselves. That doesn't translate over into the financial health of the relationship. And so among couples that are married and have children, 6% live in poverty. Among couples who live together and have children, 31% live in poverty. And that isn't always necessarily only tied to the amount of income, but it's still spending habits. And it's that we're not a team building together. And so since the relationship is not legally committed, neither will invest in the future of that relationship. You'll still spend like a single person. And talk to one of these married people to say, what happened to your brain when you got married concerning money. It just changes. Or if it doesn't, your spouse will change it for you quickly. Another reason the finances typically don't work out is people who live together versus those who are married typically are very much involved in very high-risk behavior. And so I pay more for health insurance, I'm sure, than anyone in the room, because I'm married and I have 5 young children. And so the 7 of us, we have a good health insurance premium to pay. However, you all pay more in car insurance than I do, because you're not very good drivers. And we have thousands of actuaries who work for insurance companies who do all the fancy statistics to show that people who are 25 and younger and single have more accidents and they make more claims. And so you have all these statisticians who are responsible for helping this insurance company, whether it's life insurance, health insurance, car insurance, to make a profit. And so they're going to charge those groups of people who make more claims. And the people who are single tend to make more claims. They tend to have more accidents. They tend to have more high-risk behavior, a much higher rate of addictive and even illegal behaviors. Behaviors that enforce that same mentality, that first question we asked of, I want to do what feels good right now. And so for some reason, the married couple, since it's about being a team, they look out for each other in a different level. Another interesting statistic was to find that the live-in girlfriend is much more likely to be attacked by a stranger than a wife is, because the husband is much more likely to protect that woman, make sure that she's not walking out at night through a bad part of town in a parking garage. He'll make sure that he's there or someone else is there. It's just that natural thing that clicks, that protective nature that comes out. This one is alarming for guys. Hopefully for girls, you'll see this. And this, again, thousands of studies put together find this one, that a husband, because of this thing on the finger, will spend 8 hours more a week doing housework than the average live-in boyfriend will do. And so for some of you, that might be motivation enough. It might not sound romantic, but again, the guy who's married is investing in the home in a different way entirely than the live-in boyfriend will. One that isn't funny at all, and that is the studies on violence. And we find that with all other factors being equal, income, ethnicity, all those other types of things, age, people who live together are twice as likely to have violent relationships and 5 times more likely to have severe, take you to the hospital kind of violence. And a live-in girlfriend is 9 times, is it not 9% more, exponentially, 9 times more likely to be killed by a live-in boyfriend than a wife is to be killed by a husband. One of the growing trends, again, when this first started years ago, there typically weren't children involved in a home for a live-in couple. Now about 30% of live-in couples have children in the home, and so the new studies are coming out attempting to measure what does that do to children. And sticking with the idea of violence, children are 11 times more likely to be abused by a live-in boyfriend than by their biological father. Again, this is astronomically different statistically. And 4 times more likely to be abused even by one's own biological father or your own biological mother if they're not married. Even if it's 2 couples living together and it's their child, they're still 4 times more likely to create an abusive relationship for that child. And children are 8 times more likely to be killed by a live-in boyfriend or girlfriend than by a biological parent. And it's been going on long enough now to where we see the statistics of what happens when these kids get in high school and the rate of depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicide, and all those things just skyrocket. Does it last? How do these relationships fare over the long term? Because that really is the goal, right? You want this to last. That's why it's a substitute for marriage. For every married couple that divorces, 5 live-in couples will separate. And so once you move in with someone, you decrease your chances of ever marrying that person exponentially. So if you got 10 couples, 5 say we're just going to get married from the beginning, 5 say we're going to live together first. 4 out of those 5 married couples will be death do us part. Only 1 of those 5 married live-in couples will ever get married. And of the ones that get married, 75% of them will get divorced. And so it's an ever-shrinking number of success. The couples that do live together and get married and stay married report much less happiness and sustainability and stability in their marriage. So yeah, there's the stat. 75% of the time, even if they do marry, they won't stay together. So we have a generation that says 62% of them say, we want to avoid divorce, and that's why we're going to live in together to make sure this works. But we have nearly 80% of everyone who moves in will never get married, and then if they do, they will almost surely get divorced. The reason the divorce rate stays high is because of couples that move in together first and get married. They keep the stats very high. The couples that don't move in together first have a much, much lower rate. Sometimes you hear that 50% rate, which is a bit mythic. But once we separate for who lives together first and who doesn't, that's when we have about a 60% differential in successful marriages later on. And so now we have all these secular researchers who are shouting from the rooftops, who have no biblical agenda whatsoever, screaming at anyone who will listen in these research journals that most people aren't reading because our culture is so opposite the other way of, hey, if you want to have a successful relationship with someone long-term, the last thing you should do is marry that person. That's the absolute worst thing, or the worst thing you could do is live in with that person first. Don't live with them, do anything. And so you all might be thinking, 80% of people in your generation have marriage as a major life goal, and so when does that happen for you? Some of you think, well, when I get so much money in the bank, when I finish my degree, when I get my career, when my fiance finishes school, when I start a master's program, when I get my own place. And you can take all those factors, and statistically, they're almost meaningless in terms of will the marriage be successful compared to did they live together first. That's the number one factor on the marital success rate. And so why doesn't it work? If everyone thinks it works, but overwhelmingly it doesn't, and it shouldn't be a big surprise, some of you mentioned this, it's commitment. It's something about the fact that commitment wins over convenience or attempted compatibility every time in these relationships. Commitment always wins. And so the conclusion of the studies basically say cohabitation is a different way to be single. It's not a new way to be married. You're just being single with a joint address. Everything in your life is still single. Everything about you is still single. It's not pre-marriage. It's not marriage training. It's not almost married. It's not married but not legal. It's singleness. And that's what everything points to. Because the idea is, if I'm keeping you around for convenience, I won't be around when it's inconvenient. Right? If I'm waiting for something better to come along, I don't want to be the one that gets dumped. I'm much more likely to be the dumper. If I'm likely to be cheated on, I want to be the one who's going to cheat first. I don't want to be cheated on. And so without the commitment being the glue that holds us together, we fall back on other not so healthy relationship patterns, like manipulation. How do I get the other person to do what I want? Manipulation becomes. And so that's why it doesn't really work, because the commitment simply isn't there. And so you get the commitment right, and then you make things work after that. Not compatibility. You don't move in to find if you're compatible. My wife and I are complete opposites. A lot of our good friends, spouses, are completely opposite almost every way. Sometimes that makes it hard. Sometimes that makes it fun. But we work through it. Other couples I know, it's like you all share the same brain, you finish each other's sentences, you're exactly alike. But they're not together because they're compatible. They're together because they're committed to each other, and they make it work within that commitment. They start out as a team and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do it together, and that's the way it's going to be, and that's the way they make it work out. As soon as I go into the relationship trying to think, I'm going to just test this out for a while, it doesn't work. It doesn't work to do something like the shoe analogy. The shoe analogy doesn't work because my shoes are just to serve me. They don't have opinions. They don't have a will. They don't have emotions. They don't have dreams. They don't have a right. They don't have a say. They just are there for the purpose of my comfort and my enjoyment. And if I want to walk through the mud in them, I'll walk through the mud in them. If I want to change them out, I'll change them out. And so when you look at it that way, this whole idea of comparing another person created in the image of God with a pair of shoes, it's pretty devastating to think of it that way. That's why it doesn't work. That's why we can't compare people to things. And when you try it out first, that's what you're doing, whether you realize it or not. Got just another minute here. I'd like you to take out your phones. I typically don't, I'm not a big fan of phones, but go ahead and take these out real quick. I'd like you to text someone who's a mentor for you. Could be an RA, could be a pastor, could be someone you trust. Someone who will text back. That's the idea. I want you to text this statement to them to get a conversation started in this area. I will decide instead of slide. And this comes from one of to me, the most startling statistic was of all couples who lived together, over 50% never even had a conversation about it before they did it. They fell into it. It just happened. Started sleeping over so often that after a while, all my stuff's at their place. And then my car breaks down and I can't afford the car bill and my rent this month, so I just stopped paying rent. And over half couples say, we didn't even decide to do this. We just, after a few weeks, realized we were doing it. They slid, or will slide instead of decide. So text someone that you trust that might have a conversation in this area and say, I will decide instead of slide. These people slide into it. So if you've seen what happens, you make up your mind, you know what you ought to do, try to decide instead of slide, and see if someone will email back and say, what were you talking about? What does this mean? Well, in terms of relationships, I want to make particular decisions ahead of time to not slide into being manipulated or being a manipulator or treating someone like a pair of shoes. And maybe you could even decide to read a book. This book here, The Ring Makes All the Difference, is where a lot of these statistics come from. Might be a study for you. Right, as you're texting there, I'll go ahead and say a prayer and dismiss us. Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you that you had it all figured out in Genesis 1 and 2. You made one man and one woman for life, and that was your design. And the world tries to ask the wrong questions and gets the wrong answers and fights that design and ends up with heartache and heartbreak and shattered lives. We pray that you will help us to minister to those people, many of whom close friends in our churches. We pray that you will save us from sliding into a mentality that tries to take shortcuts around your design. We thank you for the grace that you give of lives that have made mistakes, of people that have gone this route, and you can still make things work out. That's what your grace does for us. But we still pray, even amid your grace, that we would be wise, that we would decide and not slide into the wrong choices in relationships. It's in Jesus' name, amen.